Good morning. I'm Stephen Leake. I'm an elder at First Presbyterian Church of Mesquite, Texas, and I'm also the teacher of the Discipleship Sunday School class there. Today we're continuing with our study of the Gospel of John. And I'd like to remind you that for our curriculum, we're using the Daily Bible Study Series by Professor William Barclay. And for our scripture, we're using the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. Now, we've just finished studying all the text in chapter 11, verses 1 through 44, which relate the story of the raising of Lazarus. And today we're going to talk about just what that means to us as Christians and how we interpret that as Christians. We've tried to expound the raising of Lazarus simply as the story stands written. But we cannot evade the fact that of all the miracles of Jesus, this one has to be considered the greatest. But now we must face the difficulties of this particular scripture. First, in the other three Gospels, there are accounts of people being raised from the dead. There's the story of Jairus' daughter in Matthew 9:18 through 26, Mark 5:21 through 43, and Luke 8:40 through 56. And there's the story of the raising of the widow's son at Nain in Luke 7:11 through 16. In both cases, the raising occurred immediately after death. So it would be quite possible to believe that in both these miracles, the person raised was just in a coma. And we've seen how burial had to follow quickly after death in the climate in Palestine. And we know from evidence of graves that people were frequently buried alive because they were buried in haste. It could well be that these were miracles of diagnosis in which Jesus saved two young people from a dreadful death. But there's no parallel whatever for the raising of a man who'd been dead for 4 days and whose body had begun to putrefy. Second, in the other three Gospels, there's no account, not even a mention, of the raising of Lazarus. If the other writers knew of this miracle, how could they possibly omit it? If it actually happened, how could they fail to know of it? It's been suggested that the answer is this. We know that Mark drew his information from Peter. And the fact is that Peter does not appear in the fourth gospel at all in chapter 5 or from chapters 7 through 12. Thomas is in fact the spokesman for the disciples. It's been suggested that Peter was not with Jesus at this time and only came up later for Passover. On the face of it, that does not seem likely. And even if Peter was not there, surely the writers of the Gospels must have heard about this miracle. Third, perhaps the greatest difficulty is that John sees in this miracle the essential cause that moved Jewish authorities to take definite steps to eliminate Jesus. And that's in our scripture for next week, John 11:47 through 54. In other words, the raising of Lazarus was the direct cause of the crucifixion. In the other three Gospels, the great moving cause of the crucifixion was the cleansing of the temple. And you may recall from our earlier lessons that the cleansing of the temple occurred in the first Passover that Jesus went to, not the third one here. It's difficult to understand why the other three gospel writers have nothing to say of it, if it was the immediate cause of Jesus' crucifixion. Fourth, on the other hand, it might well be argued that the triumphal entry is inexplicable without this miracle to go before it. Why otherwise did Jesus receive that tremendous reception when he arrived in Jerusalem? Yet the fact remains that in the story, as the other three Gospels tell it, there's just no space for this miracle to be fitted. If then this is not a record of actual historical fact, how can we explain it? First, the 19th century French scholar Ernest Renan suggested that the whole thing was a deliberate fraud arranged by Jesus together with Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. That explanation has only to be stated out loud to be dismissed as incredible. And later, even Renan himself departed from it. Second, it's been suggested that Lazarus was in a coma. But it would be impossible to argue that from the story as it is written. The details of Lazarus' death are just too vivid. Third, it's been suggested that the story is an allegory written around this saying of Jesus, "I am the resurrection and the life." A story composed to illustrate that saying and give it a setting. That may be an oversimplified and overstated version of the truth. Fourth, it's been suggested that the story is to be connected with the parable of Dives and Lazarus in Luke 16:19 through 31. That story ends with the saying that even if someone was raised from the dead, the Jews would still not believe it. It suggested that the story was produced to show that somehow one did rise from the dead and the Jews still did not believe. When we consider the difficulties of this story, we are compelled to say that we do not know what happened, although undoubtedly something tremendous did happen. But we do know for certain the truth which it teaches. Robert McAfee Brown, an American professor, tells of something which this story did. He was an American Army chaplain on a troop ship in which 1,500 Marines were returning home from Japan to America for discharge. He was approached by a small group to do a Bible study with them. Near the end of the voyage, they were studying this chapter, and afterwards a Marine came to him and said, "Everything in this chapter points to me." He went on to say that he had been in hell for the last 6 months. He had gone straight into the Marines from college, and he had been immediately sent out to Japan. Before that, he'd been in trouble, bad trouble. Nobody knew about it except God. He felt guilty, and he felt his life was ruined. He felt he could never face his family, although they never needed to know. And he felt dead inside. "And," said the young Marine, "after reading this chapter, I have come alive again. I know that this resurrection Jesus was talking about is real here and now, for he has raised me from dead to life." In his sin and his sense of guilt, he had found Jesus in the resurrection and the life. It does not really matter whether or not Jesus literally raised a corpse to life in AD 30. But it matters intensely that Jesus is the resurrection and the life for everyone who is dead in sin and dead to God today. There may be problems with this story, and we may never know what exactly happened in Bethany so many, many years ago. But we know for certain that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And that is what the story tells us. and that is what really matters. Thanks for joining me today. God bless each and every one of you.